Yeah, I wish, yeah, part of me wishes I had some real specific stories, but really that summer, I mean, it changed my life. I'm not doing what I'm doing without it. When I applied to be a peace intern, I had just gotten back from a study abroad trip in Israel and Palestine. And so my plan that summer was I was going to talk about those experiences. I was going to talk a lot about settlements and the stories that I'd learned from Palestinian friends and neighbors. And spent the whole week going into that Peace Intern training week where we were constructing our workshop and building this, what I thought was the most creative workshop ever. And then left eager, got to my first week at Camp Kumbaya in Western Kentucky and did my first workshop, and it was an absolute disaster. This was 2014, so the conversations that we're having now around what's happening, especially in Gaza and in the West Bank, were not as much in people's worldview. And so I found working with these young folks, primarily high schoolers that week, they had a hard enough time pointing to the Middle East on the map. And so then try to add in the complexities of what that conflict has been and what that conflict has meant was a whole other challenge. Um, and so after two or three workshops, I decided maybe this was not going to be the most fruitful way for us to have conversations around issues of peace and social justice. And had this instinctual thought of, well, maybe we'll talk about the things that are most interesting to our young people. And so I remember coming up with this idea where we would sit down in a circle, we would light a candle, and I would say, write down anything you want to on a piece of paper. It doesn't have to be anything related to peace and social justice. You can draw a picture, you can tell me a joke, and then I would kind of tactfully insert some potential options in there of maybe you'll want to talk about what's happening in Israel, Palestine. Maybe you'll want to talk a little bit about race and reconciliation. Maybe a little bit about economic justice and poverty and how a country like ours has people that are unhoused. Just to give them a couple ideas. And so we would just pull then these note cards at random. And as the summer went on, I was able to take things like somebody drew a picture of a tree, and we had a long conversation around environmental justice. When people drew a picture of folks holding hands, we talked about what it meant to be affirming of LGBTQ folks and God's expansive love. Um, on occasion, we got to talk about what was happening in Israel and Palestine, and I got to tell stories of my friend Samir, who spent his days wrestling with checkpoints, spent months separated from his family because the checkpoints were closed and he was not able to come back in. And to see people start to ask different questions, to start to think about the world in different ways. But all of that came out of their own conversations. And so my big takeaway from that Peace Intern summer especially was our young folks have passion. They have dreams and they have hopes for the world. They are faithfully creative. And even as I have grown into my own, full-time ministry, I've really become convicted that God does beautiful things with people who show up openly and authentically, and have discovered a whole sense of hope, um, largely through those conversations that were mostly organic. Um, there's a sense of sometimes this work of justice really begins in our ability to just set a space, to show up in community with one another, to be in relationship together, to center this spirit of Christ's table, to set spaces where there's belonging and there's openness and love. And then we remember that we are not alone. Um, yes, I'm thankful for my Peace Intern summer to lead me to that. Uh, the other story I want to tell, I'm now in my seventh, eighth year of full-time congregational ministry, and that sense of call had been stirring prior to my Peace Intern summer, but I went in to undergrad thinking I was going to be a lawyer. I went into grad school thinking that I was going to be get my PhD and teach. But there was one particular moment, my Peace Intern summer at a camp, in which we had spent all week having these breakthrough moments. We spent all week believing in what was possible because these young folks showed up with such a sense of love and openness and a sense of how we create communities where people can thrive. And it was at the end of the week, we had our last night worship service. And, at church camp, worship on the last night is always just a little bit more special. And so we had it in the evening, and the path down to the Vespers area had been lined with tiki torches. And the directors said, "Hey, would you mind carrying the communion elements down and setting them on the table before worship starts?" And so I grabbed a loaf of bread and a cup and started walking down this dimly lit tiki torch path. In the background was Sufjan Stevens' cover of "Come Thou Fount" playing, and so I can hear that clanky banjo strumming. And I got about halfway down the path, and I just kind of froze, um, because I had this moment in which I could feel this weight of responsibility. You spend all week listening to these young folks dream and showing up at the table together, and then to think about what it means to actually set the table in a world that is hurting and broken. One in which, yeah, we talked so much about peace, and yet we're very clear on the absence of it. Um, and so, yeah, that kind of spiritual moment of, oh, I think I know what this work is. Of we share bread with one another, we share cup with one another, but in that we are also sharing life with one another, and we're sharing a responsibility to continue to set spaces in which all of God's people can thrive. That love is our norm, that goodness is our foundation, um, and all of that comes out of just these incredible experiences of getting to be a peace intern.